When people first hear the phrase the death of God, it can sound shocking, even offensive, as though someone is making a literal claim about the divine. But historically and philosophically, the statement was never meant to describe an actual death. Rather, it was a diagnosis, a warning about a profound transformation taking place inside the human heart and across entire civilizations. The phrase points to a world in which God is no longer central to how people think, choose, hope, or fear. It describes the gradual removal of the sacred from public life, from moral reasoning, and ultimately from personal identity. So the real question before us is not whether God has died, but what happens to the human being when the awareness of God disappears. For centuries, belief in God provided more than rituals or theology. It offered a framework through which suffering made sense, justice had meaning, and morality carried weight beyond personal preference. When a person believed that life was created with purpose, and that every action would return to a higher accountability, even the smallest choices became significant. Patience in hardship, honesty in secrecy, and sacrifice for others were not irrational burdens. They were meaningful investments in an eternal reality. Remove that horizon, and something subtle yet dangerous begins to unfold. Actions may still look moral on the surface, but the foundation beneath them weakens. Meaning becomes negotiable. Truth becomes flexible, and slowly, without people even realizing it, the center begins to collapse. This is why the discussion is not merely theological, it is deeply psychological. Human beings are not designed to live in a universe that feels accidental and silent. We search for purpose the way lungs search for air. When society tells the individual that existence has no higher meaning, the soul does not become free, it becomes restless. Anxiety rises not only from personal problems, but from an unspoken question: if nothing ultimately matters, why continue striving at all? Many modern crises, identity confusion, loneliness, despair, are often treated as purely social or chemical issues, yet beneath them lies a spiritual disorientation. The heart was created to anchor itself in something eternal. When that anchor is removed, the waves of life feel unbearable. At the same time, declaring God irrelevant does not eliminate the human need for worship. It simply redirects it. History shows that when divine authority is abandoned, new gods quickly take its place: wealth, power, fame, ideology, even the self. But unlike the divine, these substitutes cannot carry the weight of ultimate meaning. They promise fulfillment yet produce exhaustion. They elevate desire but neglect the soul, and eventually they leave a person emptier than before. So the so-called liberation from God often becomes a quieter form of slavery to impulse, to social approval, or to endless comparison. This brings us to the heart of the matter. The phrase death of God is less a statement about heaven and more a mirror held up to humanity. It reveals not the absence of the divine, but the distance of the human heart from the divine. And once we understand that, the debate changes completely. The real urgency is no longer philosophical curiosity, it is spiritual survival, because when the awareness of God fades, meaning fades with it. When meaning fades, morality weakens. And when morality weakens, both the individual soul and the wider society begin to lose their direction. So perhaps the most honest question we can ask is not, has God died? But rather, what within us has gone silent that we can no longer hear him? And the moment a person begins to ask that question sincerely is the very moment the path back to meaning quietly opens. As belief in God gradually moves from the center of life to the margins, something else quietly takes its place. This shift is often described as the rise of secular thinking, a world view that attempts to organize human existence without reference to the divine. On the surface, this may appear to offer freedom from religious authority, freedom from inherited moral structures, freedom to define truth on one's own terms. Yet history and human experience suggest that what looks like freedom can slowly transform into uncertainty. Because once a higher reference point is removed, the question immediately emerges: who then decides what is truly right and truly wrong? In a God-centered worldview, morality is anchored beyond human desire. Justice is not merely a social agreement, it is a reflection of a higher order. Compassion is not just emotional preference, it is moral responsibility. Even when people fail to live up to these ideals, the ideals themselves remain stable, untouched by time, culture, or power. But when morality is detached from the divine, it becomes vulnerable to negotiation. What one generation considers unacceptable, another may celebrate. What one society calls injustice, another may justify. Without an ultimate anchor, ethics begin to drift, shaped less by truth and more by influence. This is what philosophers describe as moral relativism, the idea that right and wrong are not fixed realities but shifting human constructions. At first glance, relativism can sound tolerant and open-minded. It seems to respect diversity and protect personal choice. But taken to its logical conclusion, it creates a profound dilemma. If all moral claims are equally subjective, then the language of justice itself begins to lose meaning. On what basis can oppression be condemned if morality is only opinion? Why should honesty be preferred over deception if both are merely social preferences? And why should sacrifice for others be praised if self-interest is just as valid? The psychological consequences of this uncertainty are often subtle but powerful. Human beings long for clarity and moral vision. We want to believe that goodness is real, that injustice truly matters, and that our choices carry significance beyond immediate reward. When society tells us that morality is fluid, the heart struggles to find solid ground. This can produce a quiet anxiety, not always conscious but deeply felt. People may continue speaking about values, rights, and dignity, yet underneath those words lies an unspoken question. Are these realities, or are they simply agreements that could change tomorrow? At the societal level, the effects become even more visible. When moral truth is reduced to preference, the strongest voices often shape the outcome. Power begins to replace principle. Popularity replaces wisdom, and what is legally permitted gradually becomes confused with what is morally right. History repeatedly shows that human authority alone cannot guarantee justice. Societies without higher accountability do not become neutral. They become vulnerable to new forms of domination, even while claiming liberation. From an Islamic perspective, this moment of confusion is not surprising. Revelation teaches that when humanity distances itself from divine guidance, it does not enter moral neutrality, it enters moral instability. The purpose of divine law is not restriction for its own sake, but protection of what is timelessly good. Life, dignity, truth, family, and justice. These are not cultural accidents, they are sacred trusts. And when they are preserved through awareness of God, they provide stability that human opinion alone cannot sustain. So the real debate is not between religion and freedom, as it is sometimes framed. The deeper question is whether true freedom can exist without moral truth, and whether moral truth can survive without a source beyond humanity itself. Every civilization must eventually answer this, not only through philosophy, but through the lived reality of its people. And perhaps this is the reflection we are left with. When right and wrong become whatever we choose them to be, we may feel powerful for a moment, but we also become profoundly lost. Because a world without moral direction does not create freer humans. It creates uncertain souls searching in the dark for a light they once knew. Once morality becomes uncertain and meaning begins to drift, the consequences do not remain in philosophy books or academic debates. They enter the inner world of the human being. This is where the discussion becomes deeply personal, because the question of God is never only about theology. It is about the condition of the heart, the stability of the mind, and the direction of a person's life. When the sense of the divine fades, something subtle begins to unravel within the human psyche. Human beings are created with an instinctive search for purpose. We are not satisfied merely surviving, eating, working, and sleeping. Even those who claim that life has no higher meaning still live as though their choices matter. They pursue happiness, resist injustice, and hope for something better tomorrow. This contradiction, reveals an important truth. The human soul is wired to seek significance beyond the material world. When that significance is denied, the search does not disappear. It becomes confused, restless, and often painful. In a world described as godless or spiritually silent, many people experience what philosophers call existential anxiety. It is not always dramatic or visible. Sometimes it appears as a quiet emptiness, a feeling that achievements do not satisfy as much as expected, or that distractions must constantly fill an uncomfortable silence. A person may gain wealth, recognition, or pleasure, yet still sense that something essential is missing. This is not simply emotional weakness. It is the consequence of removing ultimate meaning from existence. When life is framed as temporary and accidental, the heart struggles to understand why effort, sacrifice, or patience should matter at all. Modern psychology increasingly observes rising levels of loneliness, depression, and identity confusion, even in societies with unprecedented comfort and technology. While many factors contribute to this reality, the spiritual dimension cannot be ignored. Material progress answers the question of how to live, but it cannot answer why to live. And without a convincing answer to why, the human spirit becomes fragile. Small hardships feel overwhelming. Delays feel pointless. Suffering feels cruel rather than meaningful. In contrast, when a person believes that life is guided by divine wisdom and that every hardship carries unseen purpose, resilience grows. Patience becomes possible because pain is no longer meaningless. Another consequence of losing awareness of God is the burden of absolute self-definition. If there is no higher guidance, then each individual must create identity, purpose, and morality alone. At first, this sounds empowering, but in reality, it places an unbearable weight on the human mind. To design one's entire meaning from nothing is not freedom. It is pressure. Every failure feels final. Every uncertainty feels threatening. And the constant need to prove one's worth becomes exhausting. Faith, by contrast, lifts this burden. It tells the human being, you are not accidental, you are not forgotten, and your value is not dependent on the changing opinions of the world. Perhaps most importantly, belief in God transforms the experience of suffering. Pain is one of the greatest psychological challenges in any world. Without divine purpose, suffering appears random and unjust, but with faith, suffering can become a path of growth, purification, and eventual reward. This does not remove the pain, but it gives the pain direction, and direction is often the difference between despair and endurance. So when we observe widespread anxiety, emptiness, and confusion in the modern world, the discussion should move beyond symptoms to deeper causes. The crisis may not only be social or economic, it may be spiritual at its core. A heart disconnected from its creator will continue searching, even if it does not know what it is searching for. And this leaves us with a question that is both simple and profound. If removing God from life has not brought the peace we expected, is it possible that the peace we are seeking has been waiting for us in His remembrance all along? As the inner consequences of a godless framework begin to surface, uncertainty, anxiety, and the fragile search for meaning, the philosophical questions return with even greater urgency. Because ideas are never isolated, they must eventually face the test of logic. And when we examine the claim that human existence can sustain meaning, morality, and justice without any reference to the divine, we are not merely engaging in theology. We are asking whether the structure of reality itself can support the weight we place upon it. One of the central challenges in a purely material understanding of life is the question of objective morality. If the universe is ultimately the product of blind forces, without intention or consciousness, then moral values become difficult to ground in anything permanent. Kindness and cruelty may feel different to us emotionally, but on what basis can one be declared truly right and the other truly wrong in an ultimate sense? They may be socially useful distinctions, but usefulness is not the same as truth. A society might decide that honesty is beneficial today and inconvenient tomorrow. Without a higher reference point, morality risks becoming a human invention rather than a discovered reality. This difficulty becomes even clearer when we consider justice. Human history is filled with oppression that was once legal, accepted, and even praised by dominant cultures. If moral standards are created only by societies, then no society can ever be truly unjust, only different. Yet something within the human conscience refuses to accept this conclusion. We instinctively believe that certain actions are wrong, even if the entire world approves of them. This inner moral awareness points beyond social agreement towards something deeper, something that does not change with time or power. The philosophical question, then, is simple but profound. Where does this unchanging moral claim come from in a universe that is supposed to be indifferent? Meaning presents a similar dilemma. If human life is ultimately temporary and accidental, then any purpose we assign to it exists only for a brief moment before disappearing completely. Achievements fade, memories vanish, and eventually even civilizations turn to dust. In such a framework, meaning can feel emotionally comforting, but intellectually fragile. Why should sacrifice matter if nothing endures? Why should truth be defended if falsehood and truth share the same final silence? These are not abstract puzzles. They shape how seriously a person takes love, courage, and responsibility. Some philosophers have responded by suggesting that humans must create their own meaning, yet this solution quietly assumes the very value it tries to produce. To say that self-created meaning is important already requires believing that human choice has real worth. But if worth itself has no objective foundation, then the meaning we create becomes indistinguishable from illusion. The mind may declare purpose, while the deeper logic of the world, quietly removes it. From an Islamic intellectual tradition, these tensions are not surprising. Revelation consistently invites human beings to reflect on the harmony between moral intuition and divine reality. The existence of objective good, the longing for justice, and the search for lasting meaning are not accidents of psychology. They are signs pointing toward a purposeful creator. Rather than diminishing reason, belief in God provides the grounding that reason itself seeks. It allows morality to be more than preference, justice to be more than power, and meaning to be more than temporary imagination. What emerges, then, is not a simplistic argument but a convergence. The human conscience, the structure of moral reasoning, and the universal hunger for purpose all seem to lean in the same direction. Denying the divine does not erase these realities. It only makes them harder to explain. And the more sincerely one follows the questions of morality, justice, and meaning to their logical end, the more they begin to resemble signposts rather than mysteries, indications that existence is not silent after all. So the debate is no longer only about whether belief in God is comforting or traditional. It becomes a question of coherence. Which vision of reality truly explains the moral depth we experience within ourselves? Because in the end, a world view is measured not by how loudly it speaks of freedom, but by whether it can honestly account for truth. And a truth that cannot explain why goodness matters will never be strong enough to guide a human soul. After traveling through questions of meaning, morality, and the psychological weight of a world that imagines itself without God, it becomes necessary to pause and ask how revelation itself responds to this entire discussion. Because within the Islamic world, the premise of God's absence is not simply rejected, it is transformed. The Quran does not engage the idea that God could disappear from existence, for the divine is described as **al-hayy**, the ever-living, whose life is not dependent on time, matter, or human recognition. God does not fade when societies forget him, just as the sun does not cease to exist when a person closes their eyes. The change, therefore, is never in the divine reality, it is in human awareness. This distinction is subtle but profound. Much of the modern conversation assumes that belief in God rises and falls like a cultural trend, as though the divine were strengthened by faith and weakened by doubt. Revelation reverses this assumption. It teaches that God is constant, absolute, and independent, while the human heart is what fluctuates, sometimes illuminated, sometimes veiled. When people speak of a world without God, they are often describing not a change in heaven, but a silence within themselves. And that silence is not proof of God's absence, it is evidence of distance. The Quran repeatedly calls human beings back to remembrance, not because God needs to be remembered, but because humans need to remember in order to remain whole. Awareness of the divine anchors identity, stabilizes morality, and gives suffering a direction. Without that anchor, the self becomes vulnerable to every shifting current of culture and desire. With it, even uncertainty can be endured with dignity. This is why faith in Islam is not presented merely as a theological position, but as a form of inner restoration, a return to clarity after confusion, to purpose after wandering. Equally important is the Quranic emphasis on responsibility. If God were truly absent, then ultimate justice would also be absent. Many wrongs in this world remain unresolved. Many oppressors escape consequence, and many acts of goodness go unseen. A universe without divine accountability would leave these stories permanently unfinished. But Revelation insists that nothing is lost, nothing is ignored, and nothing is meaningless. Every action, public or private, exists within a moral universe governed by perfect knowledge and perfect justice. This belief does more than comfort the oppressed. It restrains the oppressor and dignifies the ordinary choices of daily life. Islamic thought also reframes the experience of doubt itself. Moments of spiritual distance are not treated as final verdicts on faith, but as invitations to search more deeply. The tradition is filled with reminders that hearts can rust and be polished again, that guidance can return after confusion, and that no person is too far to turn back. In this way, the response to a seemingly godless age is not despair, but renewal. The solution is not to mourn the darkness endlessly, but to rekindle light beginning within the individual soul. What emerges from this perspective is a quiet but powerful reassurance. The stability we seek in philosophy, psychology, and morality already exists in the divine reality that Revelation describes. The question is not whether God is present, but whether we are Arabic, Het Arabic, Alif Arabic, Daida Arabic, wrought present in awareness, humility, and remembrance. When that presence returns, meaning returns with it, direction returns with it, hope returns with it. And perhaps this is the most transformative realization of all. God has never been absent from the human story. The only absence that ever truly existed was our own turning away. And the moment we turn back, we discover that the path to Him was never closed. When all of these threads are brought together, the fading of sacred awareness, the uncertainty of morality, the psychological restlessness of a world searching for meaning, and the philosophical struggle to ground truth without the divine, we arrive at a moment that is not merely analytical, but deeply practical. Because the ultimate question is no longer what has happened to belief in God, but what can be restored within the human being now. Discussions and debates may diagnose the crisis, but healing requires movement. And the restoration of meaning does not begin in institutions or arguments. It begins quietly within the heart of a single person who decides to return. Reviving meaning in a confused age is not about withdrawing from the modern world, nor is it about rejecting reason or progress. Rather, it is about recentering the human experience around a truth that modern life often pushes to the margins, that existence is purposeful, that morality is real, and that every moment of life is lived before the awareness of God. This shift may sound abstract, yet its effects are intensely concrete. When a person genuinely believes that their life carries divine purpose, patience in hardship becomes strength rather than resignation. Ordinary responsibilities become acts of worship rather than burdens. Even private struggles gain dignity because they are witnessed by one whose knowledge is complete and whose mercy is vast. Spiritual revival also begins with small, consistent acts rather than dramatic transformations, a moment of sincere reflection. A prayer spoken with attention instead of habit, a decision to choose honesty when deception would be easier. These actions may appear insignificant in a world obsessed with spectacle, yet they are precisely how the heart is rebuilt. Meaning rarely returns through sudden emotion, it returns through steady remembrance, and as remembrance deepens, clarity follows. The noise of confusion begins to fade, replaced by a quieter certainty about why one lives and where one is ultimately going. Equally important is the recognition that hope must be reclaimed. A society that imagines itself distant from God often becomes trapped between distraction and despair, distracted to avoid emptiness, and despairing when distraction fails. Faith interrupts this cycle by reopening the future. It teaches that no sin is beyond forgiveness, no life is beyond transformation, and no darkness is beyond light. This is not naive optimism, it is a world view grounded in divine mercy and justice. To believe in God is, in essence, to believe that renewal is always possible. Yet revival is not only personal, it carries responsibility toward others. When meaning is rediscovered, it naturally expresses itself through compassion, integrity, and service. A heart connected to God cannot remain indifferent to injustice or suffering. In this way, spiritual awakening becomes social healing. Communities regain trust, relationships regain sincerity, even disagreement regains dignity because it is guided by ethics rather than ego. The presence of God in human consciousness does not remove complexity from the world, but it transforms how complexity is faced. And so the journey that began with the unsettling phrase, the death of God, ends with a very different realization. The crisis was never about the disappearance of the divine. It was about the distance of the human heart and the possibility of its return. Every generation must decide whether it will live in forgetfulness or remembrance, in confusion or clarity, in temporary distraction or lasting purpose. That decision is not made once in history. It is made quietly within each soul, again and again. Perhaps then, the most important step forward is also the simplest: to pause, to reflect, and to turn back toward the one who is never absent. Because when a single heart rediscovers God, an entire world of meaning is reborn, and the path from darkness to light begins with that one sincere return.